guest today was a nurse during World War II. As a young 19-year-old, she worked tirelessly in a hospital in Burntwood, just outside Lichfield, where she was nursing badly injured soldiers who were brought home from battle, including the shores of Dunkirk. It was a life-changing experience. She claims that wartime nursing made her grow up quickly, and such was her dedication and commitment to her profession that she represented Britain's nurses from the war during the 70th anniversary of the rescue operation at Dunkirk. She has lived through a period of dramatic change, and today, at the age of 94, she is still telling her incredible story. It is my pleasure to welcome Ethel Lote to Life Stories. Well, Ethel, welcome to Life Stories, and you were born in Walsall.
Walsall Wood.
Walsall Wood, let's get it right, in 1920.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Walsall in the 1920s.
Well, we moved from Walsall Wood to Shellfield, which was the next village, when at the age I was just 4 years old. And I always remember the move to that house, because when I looked up as we got out of must have been a van because we hadn't got a car, there were 3 beautiful big round brass balls hanging on the wall outside this house. It's quite a biggish house. I didn't know till afterwards that it used to be a pawn shop before we moved there. But my mother always told me, when they took these balls down, the day after we moved in, because it wasn't a pawn shop any longer, that I cried for these beautiful balls outside the house.
You don't really see them anymore, do you, pawn breakers?
No, you
Well, I suppose they're there.
But that was like to represent the pawn shop. And I remember sometime during my childhood, we had a very bad winter and it was really cold, and everybody had coal fires because everybody around there, the men were miners, you see, and a spark from someone's chimney must have set the wood on fire around, you know, at the front of the house, and the firemen came, and I remember watching the fireman going up the ladder, and he got to the top and he fell off.
Oh dear.
The water had frozen on him, and it was so cold then. And I remember him being, you know, taken away, but he survived.
Do you know what happened to him? He survived?
He survived, yes.
Probably that was your very earliest...
yeah, one of my
earliest memories, and you probably thought, I'd like to look after him, and that's why you became a nurse later on. That's a bit of a stretch. But early days in the Walsall area, was it very different, rural, more fields in those days?
Yes. At school, when we had the summer holidays, I think all the fields were full of children. We used to play in the fields all day. Nobody had got enough money to go on holiday or anything, but there were the fields and the trees and brooks, you know, just paddling in the brooks. I think the children seemed to be much more happier than they are today.
So, Ethel, would you say then that in your time as a child in the 1920s, you could literally go out of the house in the morning and your mother would say, come home at tea time, and you'd take a sandwich with you, and there wouldn't be all the worry about what had happened to you?
No, nobody locked their doors. The doors were always open and neighbours would go into one another, and quite often if we'd been sort of playing in the fields all day, and we perhaps wouldn't go to our own homes, we'd go to somebody else and have a meal. But and one of the nicest things I remember as a child as well, I think I told you, my mother taught music, and every Sunday evening the house would be full of people and children all singing.
So no television?
Oh no.
Radio?
No, we
had radio come in?
No, we hadn't got a radio when I was young. And then when I was 6 years old, I was the eldest of 4 children, you see. And the youngest, my brother, was born in 1926. And it was the time of the miners' strike.
Now, your father was a coal miner,
a coal miner.
Yes.
Yes. And of course, nearly all the men in the villages around Walsall were either coal miners or they worked in the brickyard. So nobody had really got any money. So of course I said we didn't go on holiday, but we always enjoyed ourselves. And you know, everybody would be playing together, the children would be you know, all there. But I remember one day we got a garden with a high wall, and there was a little girl lived over the other side of the wall, and sometimes she used to climb up this wall and come over to our side. And I always remember we were playing at Mothers and Fathers or something, and I said I was a hairdresser, and I cut this little girl's hair, cut all the curls off. And I never forget my mother smacking my legs, and her mother, I think, being very, you know, very bad about it. But
so were you a bit of a naughty girl then?
Well, I didn't know I was, did I? Because I was cutting her hair for her.
Well, you were a hairdresser.
But
yeah, in your yes.
I was, I think, about in my 80s, and I think I'd been on the television, which was probably when it was the Dunkirk do, because you know it was on all the time. And a lady rang me up, and she said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "No." It was this little girl whose hair I'd cut off, and she was in her 80s.
Oh, what a wonderful story! What amazing! All those years later,
but she still wasn't very pleased about it.
I know you have told me when I first met you that you didn't see the sea until you were 7. Your granny took you to Rhyl. But it's interesting that from Walsall that you'd spent your summer holidays visiting Sutton Park, which is just a few miles away in Sutton Coldfield. So those are very special days, were they?
Oh, they were, yes. And when I was 6 years old, and it was the miners' strike, and my brother was born, and my grandmother came from Wolverhampton to look after my mother, you see. And when my brother was born, and I remember walking to school, which I went by myself at 6 years old, carrying a basin, and we had soup. I remember that soup at school that we had every lunchtime, because some people hadn't got anything to eat, you see, with it being the strike. You know, people just were starving.
Oh dear. So, and of course then later, I suppose, you probably didn't know about it at the time, there's the Great Depression in the 1930s and the stock market crashes and all these things that you've probably obviously learned about a little bit later. But let's move on. At the age of 15, 16, you decided you wanted to be a nurse. Now, your mother had been a nurse in World War I. Was that the inspiration?
Oh, yes, I'd always wanted to be a nurse from when I was growing, you know, very young. But I left school at 14. The school I went to in Sheffield, they used to have every year 3 children from each school in the area, or the Walsall area, could go to the grammar school. And of course the grammar school for that area was Queen Mary's. I passed the 11 plus, but then I couldn't go because my mother couldn't afford the books, and so I wasn't allowed to go. She bought the uniform, but because I couldn't afford the books, I couldn't go.
Oh dear.
So, but it didn't bother me. I went to a new school had just been built, and it was lovely. The one that I'd been going to from when I was, you know, very young, was dark and, you know, high windows and everything. But this new school was bright and it was lovely, and I loved school. But the day I was 14, I had to leave, which everybody else did at that age. The next day, I started work in a leather factory in Littleton Street in Walsall. And I went to the art school for evening classes to learn the leather trade, although I wasn't very interested in it. And then there was Crabtree's electrical factory. I don't whether it was still there in the, you know, when you were around. But I went to work there in the first aid room. And I loved that.
So the first
and that
aid...
was while I was waiting to go into training in hospital.
training. Well, that's very interesting. So you did work in the famous leather industry then in Warsaw for a while, but short while. Your mother had been a nurse in World War I, so she told you about her experiences. I think she worked in London, didn't she?
Yes.
And then your journey into nursing begins in earnest, leading up to, sadly, World War II.
Yes.
A very hard time for millions of people all around the world. And we'll pick up your story and hear about your nursing career during World War II after the break. Welcome back to Life Stories, where I'm in conversation with Ethel Lote, a remarkable 94-year-old who started her nursing career at the tender age of 19 during World War II, when she nursed badly injured soldiers from battle. Well, welcome again, Ethel. So we've heard about your childhood days and your early teenage years in Warsaw, but now we're moving towards the time when you did some training at the Manor Hospital in Warsaw, and moving on to the late 30s, World War II. Do you remember the day when Neville Chamberlain announced that Britain was at war with Germany? Did you hear that iconic radio broadcast?
Yes, I was at church, and it was 11 o'clock in the morning when it was announced, and you know we were all told straight away, and whoever was the leader, you know, said, "I think everybody should go home now." So I went home, which was only just a few yards away from the church, and most of the people in the village were all congregating around, you know, and saying the war's started. We've got to, and we had to get the blackout. They'd already been round, you know, telling everybody to get blackout curtains and everything. And the children were there getting ready with their brushes to pretend they were like the Dad's army.
Oh, Dad's army.
Yeah.
The home
and they
guard.
were all around, you know, and we used to see them marching around the village, and just like they were on the television, actually.
Yes, but obviously a very serious time for everybody, and nobody course, knowing what was going to happen.
That's right, and then there were air raid shelters being built in the gardens, and then other shelters, you know, in different places, and notices put around where they could go if there was an air raid.
So it wasn't long before you were at Burntwood Military Hospital, just outside Lichfield. So was there much training, or were you thrown in at the deep end?
I was working at the Manor Hospital at training, and I remember that I was on a men's ward, and there were just, you know, ordinary illnesses like pneumonia and things like that. And but I joined the Civil Nursing Reserve, which meant that if there was a war, I would have to go into a military hospital. Well, Burntwood was the nearest, so of course I had to leave right away, and I went to Burntwood.
And here you are as a nurse. You're just outside.
Those are the Nissen huts, which were the wards. But the hospital was built in the grounds of the St Matthew's Psychiatric Hospital, and it wasn't quite finished when I went there in 1939. And we were having, when it did open a few weeks later, we had civilian patients, because by that time Birmingham was getting not a lot of bombs, but getting bombed. And so the Birmingham hospitals were full, so they were transferring them to any other hospitals around, you know, where they could take the civilian patients. But then...
Was there any bombing around the Burntwood, Lichfield area, or not so much?
Because we were more in the country, you see. It was the cities and the towns that were being bombed. And
so when did you receive your first soldiers from... That was from Dunkirk, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, at the beginning of May 1940, the hospital was evacuated of all these civilian patients. They were sent elsewhere, and we were told that we would be receiving wounded soldiers. We didn't know where they were coming from, but in the newspapers and that it was saying about Dunkirk and about the, you know, all the men trying to flee from Dunkirk. And when then the convoy came, we could see from the windows coming up the hill this convoy of all sorts of vehicles. There were buses and lorries, and there were about 100 wounded soldiers altogether, and came in through. Of course, there was a sentry at the gates, with it being a military hospital, and they came in through the main gates. And as soon as they unloaded all these vehicles, they transferred them quickly into the Nissen huts, you know,
That picture we saw a few moments ago.
Yes. And we realised then that they were still in their uniforms, which were covered with blood and mud and sand, and they had to be cut from them.
So the uniform had stuck to the dried blood.
Yes, and they were just how they'd picked them up from the beaches of Dunkirk.
And then some of them were flown to RAF Cosford and
they were
even taken by horse and carriage from Cosford
to different hospital.
Yeah, amazing story.
It was.
Just going back a second though, it was at the military hospital where you met your future husband in a rather unusual setting.
No, that was, he was called up, conscripted into the Royal Navy and into the Fleet Air Arm in November 1939. And the only time I'd spoken to him, he was a lecturer at the first aid post. We were learning how to treat war wounded and all that, you know. And he was superintendent of the St John ambulance. And when we were at the first aid post, there were doctors lecturing also. And I was invited to go with one of the doctors to observe a post-mortem. And when we got to the mortuary, which was in the next village, Brown Hills, my fiancé, that he was afterwards, was there, and with another doctor, and there were just the four of us in this little room, and they started on the what they were doing, you know, and there was an air raid, and the air raids, they weren't really bad, but the sirens would go, and everybody would have to go to the shelters, whether there were any bombs dropping or not. But the lights all failed. And there were candles everywhere in those days. Everybody had them in the houses in case of this happening. So all the candles were lit in, and the two doctors carried on with their work that they were doing on the body.
Well, to be basic, they were carving the body.
That's right, yes. And Albert stood one side of the body, and I was standing the other, holding the candles. We were just the candlelight in this little room. And we just looked at each other and fell in love.
Incredible story. I mean, it must be one of the more unusual settings to see your future husband.
He was
sent away. So I know that you didn't see him then. You didn't actually get married until the end of the war.
No, but we should have done.
Yeah, should have done. But you then did incredible service all through the war years at the Burntwood Military Hospital. I know that you looked after hundreds of soldiers who returned from battle. Here you are as Nurse Ethel there, and I understand that some of the matrons were quite strict at Burntwood.
One matron, yes.
One matron in particular, so no names, no petrol.
No.
And so as the years go through the war, I know you saw the bombing in Birmingham, you did some work down in Stourbridge as well.
Just having to learn a bit of midwifery because we were having the women from the forces being brought to the hospital.
What, expecting a baby?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was a big learning curve, and everybody was learning and growing up very quickly.
That's right,
in all sorts of ways. And if you look back now, Ethel, through those incredible times, and I know that you then went into the dentistry after the war. You grew up very quickly. You met Albert, your husband. What's the biggest memory, the most memorable moment from those war years?
When he came back, I think.
When Albert came
yes,
back?
because I mean, our wedding was all arranged for May the 26th, and it was the day that we had the first convoy from Dunkirk. And instead of being a happy day, that was the worst day of my life, when we had the first convoy of wounded soldiers. And then I didn't see him for 5 years. And didn't hear
love
from
grew,
him
and
for
love
nearly,
was even stronger.
Yeah, didn't hear from him for nearly a year, because the convoy he'd been going out abroad and was bombed.
But a wonderful love story. We can't finish this show,
No.
though, without just showing the medal that you received when you basically went back to Dunkirk for the 70th anniversary. We've got some pictures as well up on the screen coming up in a second.
Mm-hmm.
So you went to Dunkirk, you had a marvellous trip over there with lots of other veterans from that incredible operation to bring back the soldiers from the beaches.
I heard some wonderful stories as well from them, and from some who'd been kept there as prisoners for the whole of the 5 years.
Ethel Lote, what an incredible story. You did marvellous things for your country and for your profession, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for telling us your life story.